Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look to the future.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Ailbhe.
Ailbhe, great to have you with us for the whole programme today. It is International Women's Day, but we're actually going to be talking to some of Westminster's most prominent female lawmakers about their experiences. But the news that we had today, that one of the most prominent female lawmakers, Theresa May, is stepping down as an MP at the election.
I know, end of an era.
It does feel like it. I mean, she has been such I suppose, well-known and active voice in politics, and of course one of only 3 women to hold the office of Prime Minister.
And yes, and definitely I think well respected for staying on as an MP after resigning as Prime Minister. She's quite often avoided giving real interviews and just has made speeches in the House of Commons or announcements in her local paper like today.
I loved this. I love the fact that she's given the Maidenhead Advertiser the scoop on this. We have managed to speak to Theresa May at the time of the launch of her book last year, and I wanted to take a listen to what she had to say about how some of her male colleagues reacted to her as a female Prime Minister.
I mean, I think there was some different expectations. Some of the male colleagues would, for example, have said, and sometimes actively said to me, and openly said to me, that when I was negotiating with the European Union, I should have been thumping the table, I should have been walking out of the room, I should have been slamming the door. Those very sort of aggressive ways of doing it. In fact, I had spent some years before I went into Parliament in a position where I was negotiating with the European Union, European Commission, and I'd learnt through that it was painstaking, slow, deliberate and careful negotiation on the details that got you where you wanted to be.
So as Theresa May speaking to Bloomberg last September. Perhaps no coincidence she chose to step down on International Women's Day?
See, I don't think it is at all, Stephen. I think she chose this day very deliberately, not just because she was the second ever female Prime Minister, but because some of the most important bits of her legacy for her are on things like the Domestic Abuse Act, which I think those around her would say was the thing that she's most proud of from her time in government. And if her time hadn't been taken over by Brexit, she would have wanted to do even more on that. And so, yeah, I think a little nod to, her legacy as a female Prime Minister there. And somebody who was key in promoting other women into politics as well. That's something that we've been discussing with the Conservative MP Caroline Nokes, who's the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee. We also asked her, given the recent increase in security threats facing MPs, about her personal experiences of dealing with harassment.
Well, it's really obvious that there are heightened tensions, and there have been some appalling incidents with both male and female MPs impacted. There is a narrative at the moment that it's women who are more vulnerable, but I am really concerned about LGBTQ colleagues, about any MP from a different ethnicity. I think it's really challenging for them. My experience pales into insignificance compared to the incidents that some colleagues have experienced. So, look, I got accosted by a man in the street late at night several weeks ago now, so it was pitch black. I couldn't really see who he was, and he was just sort of yelling in my face that I didn't understand anything about anything, frankly. That was unnerving because I don't really expect out on a London street to just be recognised by a random stranger. But people have become really fixated with a range of issues, and too often it seems that aggression and abuse and harassment that's taking place online is spilling into the real world.
Caroline, you mentioned colleagues of different ethnicities. We've obviously had a lot of conversation about Islamophobia in recent weeks. Are you concerned about that, including comments from some of your own colleagues?
Well, look, I think there's a responsibility on all of us to think about the language we use and to not only think about the words, but to think about the tone in which we say them. And I've always said that. My experience as an immigration minister many years ago now taught me some very important lessons about being very, very careful how you express yourself and think about the words you're going to use. And I think it's critical that we set the bar really quite high for members of Parliament and for colleagues. And I listened to my colleague Maria Miller last week talking in the Chamber about having a pledge going into the election about how we would behave towards each other and fellow candidates, the language that we would use. And I said then, and I stand by this absolutely, is I very much expect to get through the next general election without being racist, homophobic or sexist. I don't think that's a very high bar to have set for myself at all. And we have to think about how we are treating people, how we're speaking of people. We mustn't sow divisions and try and other people just to garner a few votes. It's not worth it. At the end of the day, your own integrity, your own decency matters much more than what the electorate do to you on general election day.
Does that extend to needing to put names on things, to use terms like Islamophobic when that's considered appropriate?
Yeah, I think it matters. I think it absolutely matters. So I don't have any hesitation in calling out what I see as Islamophobia when I either see or hear it. I think we need to be aware of the fact that we have an enormous amount of transphobic commentary, that there are comments that are, to be quite frank, just misogynistic. And we hear that in the House of Commons chamber. It's only a few years ago that I'm conscious not the current speaker, but the former speaker said of a colleague of mine that she was a stupid woman, and using woman as a term of almost abuse in the chamber. And so we have to be really careful how we speak of each other, how we speak of the wider public, and that we use terms that accurately describe what we see going on.
So on that note, your now former colleague Lee Anderson's comments, were they Islamophobic?
He was very wrong not to have apologised for it. Look, we can all make a mistake and learn from that and be a better politician as a result of it. None of us are perfect, but Lee very sadly refused to apologise, and I think that was a great shame.
I wonder if debates like this are hurting efforts to bring more diverse candidates into Parliament. We're looking at a general election later this year. From the indications that we have, getting representation, first of all, of more women into Parliament has been a huge challenge. Is this something that's going to make that more difficult to bring people from all minorities into the political sphere?
I think at the moment it's tough to bring anyone into the political sphere. Why would you put yourself through it? And good people are leaving. Good people are worn out and tired, and quite frankly looking at what else they could do with their lives that might give them more time to spend with their families, and time away from the abuse that our families receive as well. I'm perfectly candid in telling people there's an individual at the moment who does Facebook Lives about me in which he infers, he doesn't infer it, he states it, that my daughter is in prison for public nudity. You know, the last time I checked, she was roaming around fully dressed and hadn't been anywhere near a prison cell. But at the same time, you know, he then sent a Facebook message to me saying, "How old's your mum?" So there's no generation who is immune to it. And I don't blame colleagues for wanting to stand down to save their families from that. The flip of that is that we have to work out how we can best protect anybody, any candidate who has the guts to stick their head above the parapet. And I have an enormous amount of admiration for anyone who has the bravery to do so. But I do worry that we will see fewer women wanting to take part, that we'll see fewer people from different ethnicities. I think there's a real challenge in how you make Parliament an accessible place for disabled colleagues. And I have some fabulous, absolutely fabulous disabled colleagues, people like Rob Halfon, who drives around Westminster on his stand-up scooter thing, who makes it work. But it's difficult. And if you are finding it physically tough to get around, to add to that the mental burden of people with too much time on their hands and too few brain cells permanently trolling you on the internet, it's just exhausting.
Caroline, given that level of harassment that you personally face, that you've just described, have you ever considered being among those colleagues that you've mentioned who are just deciding for the sake of themselves and their families that they don't want to do this anymore?
Look, I'm as tough as nuts, and nobody should ever underestimate quite how resilient I am. It's really obvious, and even locally, there's an individual in my constituency whose level of harassment of me is so off the chart that he's clearly trying to intimidate me into standing down. Well, I will not be intimidated. Good luck with your mission. It's not going to work. But the stark reality is, I look at my colleague Mike Freer, whose office was subject to an arson attack, and I don't blame him for standing down. And so, of course, we all think about it, and we all think, I think for me, my biggest driver is what can I achieve for my constituents? What can I do in the sphere of women and equalities that I've been chair of the committee for 4 years and I have loved? I really, really enjoy it. It's such a worthwhile and important role. So for me, I constantly weigh up whether I still think I'm adding any value. And let me tell you, an internet troll sat in his back bedroom, probably wearing his underpants, is not the person who's going to make the decision for me.
Has your party been good for the cause of promoting greater gender equality and equality in general over the past 14 years?
Well, look, I think we've worked really hard. Initiatives like the gender pay gap have made a real difference. We've seen more women setting up their own businesses. We've seen more women in employment. And I think there have been some really great measures. I was really pleased with what Jeremy Hunt announced in the budget yesterday about child benefit. That's going to help a lot of women in my constituency. So, look, I think we have a pretty solid track record. What I would love to see the whole time is us to keep pushing further. We still have a situation where, if you look back at the COVID pandemic, women were most likely to be doing the greatest share of homeschooling, of housework. We were more likely than our male colleagues to be furloughed. We still have a horrendous problem with the gender pension gap. And so I don't underestimate how tough it is for women, particularly for single mums out there. And we constantly need to do more. We need to do more around the sexual abuse and harassment and misogyny. We've seen some brilliant bits of legislation. My colleague Greg Clark put a private member's bill through last year. The Domestic Abuse Act was really groundbreaking. And I want the online harms legislation to be effective at protecting women from the abuse that we bear the brunt of on the internet. Whether it's going to or not is very much one to wait until the legislation is bedded in, see how Ofcom's going to enforce. But there have been some great measures.
So, Caroline, it's International Women's Day. We've seen a report recently that says that 7 in 10 Tory candidates at the moment are male. What's your message to your own party on that? Would you like to see that change?
Of course I would. And what I have noticed over the course of the last 14 years is as the number of Tory women has increased, how much better Parliament is. In fact, as the number of women has increased. Look, both within parties and across parties, I think we have really been trailblazers for how you can work together, how you can get legislation changed. I would always point at the Domestic Abuse Act, where we had the Mother of the House, Harriet Harman from Labour, and Laura Farris, a very newly elected Conservative MP, combining to bring in an amendment around the rough sex defence. So look, we really are trailblazers when it comes to collaborative cross-party working, which is why I want to see more women in Parliament. I don't ever think that 30% is enough. Of course it isn't. I want us to have a 50-50 Parliament. I made it perfectly clear to the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, when he asked me how many women was enough women. I told him it was 50%. So 30% of course isn't enough. But it's better than it was when I arrived. And in 2010, when 45 female Tories arrived, we were increasing the numbers from 17, which I just think was an appallingly low number. So it's progress. It's never going to be far enough and fast enough for me.
That's Caroline Nokes, the Conservative MP and chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, speaking to us earlier.
Let's go to the other side of the House of Commons now, to a prominent campaigner against gender-based violence, who was Labour's Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities until 2020. Dawn Butler is the Labour MP for Brent Central, and she's with us now. Dawn, welcome. We've recently seen the publication of the Angelioni inquiry report into the death of Sarah Everard. Were you surprised by any of those findings? And are you hopeful that this will spark change in the Met Police?
Unfortunately, I wasn't surprised by the findings. I think I was more frustrated because I ask myself, how many reports do we need before we take action? Before we take women's safety seriously, before we stop seeing stories that women were just walking home. And the statistics of one woman being killed every 3 days is a very stubborn reality. It hasn't changed for many, many years. Normally, it's by somebody that they know, by a partner or former partner. And so what makes this report of Sarah Everard so grave is that it's from the very institution that's supposed to be there to protect us. So for me, it wasn't a surprise, it was more of a frustration. And I think we all need to question those in the police service and also question lawmakers to say, when are you going to ensure that we have policies that will ensure that women are safer?
There have been other reports which have criticised police behaviour in the past that haven't led to changes, many would argue, in the way that the police forces operate. Is this a moment, do you think, where something substantive could change in the Met's police operations?
I think that we have quite a number of stubborn gatekeepers who kind of want to see a small step change when what we actually need is a huge overhaul. So vetting. How can the police have internal vetting? And how can it be that if you fail your vetting, up until quite recently and still quite recently, there's nothing that can be done. They still have to be employed. And you have to go through all these hoops to get rid of police officers. But ultimately, the reality is it's not just individual officers. It is the structure and the system that needs to change. And if we haven't got people in charge that understand that, then they shouldn't be in charge. And that's the reality of the situation. And it is harsh. And there's people who have been working on this for a long time. Look at the Macpherson report, the Casey report. There's people in the police service that have been there a long time and they say, this is my personal passion and look how far we've come. To be frank, I don't really care how far they've come. They haven't gone far enough and we haven't seen the changes that need to happen. And that is where we need to start.
So it sounds like you're calling really for personnel changes in the Met.
100%. I mean, we have, for instance, we have a mayoral campaign at the moment on the 2nd of May. And the Conservative candidate has said, oh, this is too much hearing about all of these police officers. Let's have these discussions behind closed doors. It's that kind of thinking that means that there's always a cover-up. And so what we have to do is we have to be honest. And it's a huge thing that I'm saying here, but there needs to be a huge change within the police service. The Met Police, for instance, is way too big. It needs to be cut up into smaller sections, and there needs to be more accountability and more transparency. And we have to have a system that is in place that if you've got a police officer and this police officer is sexist, racist, misogynistic, is a domestic abuser, that the system doesn't allow him to get through. And the system can weed him out. And if that's not happening, if there's still thousands of police officers that there currently are, that is guilty of those things that I've just said, then that tells you that the system isn't working the way it should.
Dawn, we're talking to you on International Women's Day, and we heard a little bit earlier from Caroline Nokes about some of the treatment and harassment that she has received as a female MP. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your experience as a female MP and a black female MP.
Yeah, so I think the theme for this year is inspire and inclusion. And as a Black female MP, I will get more abuse than my white female counterparts just by the mere fact of my skin color. And that's the reality of the situation. And whether it be racism, whether it just be bigotry, misogynistic, misogynoir, that is just reality of the situation. And today, just today alone, I had an email from the police to say that they have found somebody who is abusing me and they're about to approach them. I don't know what will happen. I can imagine that it will go to court and they'll probably, have a suspended sentence or they will get locked up. And it's a constant thing that happens and you have to be vigilant about. But it's really unfair because as much as it is also debilitating in terms of having to see the abuse, and often I scroll, it means that I have extra work, extra burden on my shoulders because of this abuse, because I've then got to call it out, because I've then got to go to the police. And that's just an extra burden that I don't really want. And when people say things like, I can have a lot of people on social media that say things like, oh, you're always talking about race. Look, I don't always want to talk about race. I wish we lived in a post-racial society, but the reality is we don't. And skin color is seen and used as a weapon by many in many establishments and organizations, including the police. And this is why we have to talk about it. And we have to talk about it until people understand that it's an issue and until that they are inspired to do something about changing it.
So, Dawn, given that particular context for you, does Keir Starmer's Labour Party at the moment feel like a supportive place for you?
Does it feel like a supportive space for me? I suppose I'm not quite sure where you're coming from with that question, but all spaces that I occupy, there's always an element or air of friction or where there needs to be change. That's society. But yes, the Labour Party is my political home. And yes, in the main, I do feel safe within the Labour Party.
I suppose our thought around that question is a conversation that we had with Caroline Nokes a little earlier about her talking about her experience in the Conservative Party and whether she, felt the party was being sufficiently supportive of, for example, new candidates who want to run for election for the Conservative Party. I wonder, if you were speaking to women or to Black women who are interested in becoming Labour MPs, what sort of, advice would you be giving them? Would you be telling them that, yes, Labour, will welcome them and will support them in that journey?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes, but obviously the Labour Party can do more. I think that there is an issue, as Martin Ford report highlighted, that there is a hierarchy of racism and that needs to change. But ultimately, yes, we are very diverse as a party. And although a little part of me will be like, oh my gosh, no, go and do something more fun. It is absolutely, it's absolutely imperative that we have renewal and you have new people coming in and new energy, because the whole point of me being in the position that I'm in is to smooth the pathways for other people coming behind me, is to raise the issue so that they don't have to raise it, so that my battles are not their battles. They will have other battles. But if I can help to combat and bat away some of the things that I've gone through, then hopefully those new Labour MPs coming behind me, especially the Black female MPs, won't have to do that.
But Martin Ford's report is nearly 2 years old. Have things improved in that time?
It has improved, but I'm not going to say that it's been a fast improvement because it's been rather slow. But it has improved. And the important thing here is that it has been highlighted, and what we cannot do is shy away from that or try and sort of bury that report. And that's why it's important that those findings are acted upon. And it's vital and important that we have these conversations, because when I'm in the chamber and I'm having to combat the narrative from the government that's trying to roll back our rights and trying to stoke this fake culture war, it's really vital that we understand the issues that are afoot, and we know how we need to fight back with that. And that report helps us to do that.
Dawn Butler, Labour MP for Brent Central, thank you very much for joining us. That is it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and Mia Dawkins, and our audio engineers were Marifil Hussain and Sean Guastamakia. I'm Ailbhe Ray.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.